Hi there! After 3 weeks of intense gooning over Helen, the second half of Anti-Peril is finally about to start, with Phaetusa's release only 2 days away. She's a Corrosion Sentinel who wields a blade, coincidentally only the second rate-up character to do so after Alred. Aside from effectively replacing Petya on the Corrosion team, her role is that of a dedicated boss killer, offering decent damage at baseline. At high investment, she even manages to temporarily snatch Klukai's spot as a team's hypercarry, though that glory is relatively short-lived. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. As usual, we'll break down her kit and gameplay, investment breakpoints and builds before diving into her overall strengths and weaknesses. Without further ado, let's get to it. Like Petya, Phaetusa initiates a support action when allies within range deal AoE damage with an active attack. Her support action deals 90% of her attack as melee AoE corrosion damage and can occur 3 times per turn. Following the attack, another instance of damage is triggered via Lacerating Wound. This is a debuff that all blade users have, though currently this only entails Phaetusa and Alred, the latter of which received this mechanic via her second expansion key. Enemies with Lacerating Wound take additional damage equal to about 40% of an attack if inflicted by a blade user. The boss is affected by the debuff prior to Phaetusa's action due to her second fixed key. Notably, this effect is considered as a separate instance of melee damage. Phaetusa's passive restores 1 Confectance point when dealing melee damage, up to 3 times per turn, so with 1 support action, Phaetusa restored 2 points. With the next attack from Petya, Phaetusa's second support action is triggered, thereby fully recharging her index. Her Confectance index is solely dedicated to the use of hers too. The skill consumes 6 points to apply Lacerating Wound to all enemies for 2 turns. Since Phaetusa recharges 3 points per turn, she will cycle the skill every other round, allowing for permanent uptime of the debuff. Then, she gains 1 stack of Blade Resonance. This can stack up to 3 times and doesn't have an effect of its own. Rather, the stacks are consumed by Phaetusa's ultimate for significant bonus damage. That said, the skill grants extra command, which Phaetusa follows up with her ultimate in this case, or alternatively with her S1. Which of the 2 abilities you prioritize here depends on your plan for the battle. As you will see, Phaetusa's gameplay revolves around building towards unleashing a burst of damage at 1 or 2 points, depending on her investment, over the course of a 7-turn fight, so her rotation needs to be adapted to the boss's greatest damage window. Before elaborating on this point further, let's explore how her ultimate works. Phaetusa's ultimate deals 90% of her attack as melee corrosion damage in a 5-tile area around her position. The multiplier increases by 10% for each Blade Resonance stack, and more importantly, an additional instance of damage is added per stack. With 1 stack, the multiplier increases to 100% and is then doubled for a total of 200% damage. At 3 stacks, you're looking at a base of 120%, which is then quadrupled for a total of 480% damage. As she uses the ultimate, you can see the first instance of damage from the ultimate at a multiplier of 100% since Phaetusa has 1 stack of Blade Resonance. As the attack continues, notice the stack gets consumed and another instance of damage is added to the total, increasing from about 43k to roughly 86k damage. This continues to happen for each stack of Blade Resonance consumed. While hard to see with this camera angle, Lacerating Wound follows up with approximately 40% of the ultimate's total damage, adding another 30k on top. Now that you hopefully understand the impact of stacking Blade Resonance, let's resume the previous point of how we need to carefully think through Phaetusa's battle plan. In this showcase, Phaetusa is V0 and aims to align her best damage output with the final turn of the match. To do so, she will need Blade Resonance to be fully stacked on turn 7. Her S2 is the only ability to generate stacks, and due to her Confectance economy, can only be used on odd-numbered rounds. At V0, she restores 1 stack per use, so after using it on turn 1, 3 and 5, her highest burst can be unleashed at the earliest on turn 5. Using the ultimate on turn 1 means the first stack gets consumed though, so the next opportunity for her best damage is shifted to turn 7. At V1 and above, she only requires 2 uses of her S2 to max out these stacks, so these considerations change then. Now that Phaetusa used up all of her Confectance points, she needs 2 turns to recharge her index for the next use of the S2. As noted before, she restores a point when dealing melee damage up to 3 times per turn. Everything in her kit is considered as melee damage, but in practically every functional setup she will recharge the points before it is her turn via support actions. Then, on the second round, she proceeds by using her S1. This ability lets her select a position in an 8-tile cross-shaped area to which she will teleport, dealing 90% of her attack as AoE corrosion damage along the path. Note that her S1 and ultimate have the same multipliers at V0, so on this turn without any blade resonance stacks, the two abilities are interchangeable and can be chosen based on whether you need mobility or coverage. This is only true if you use the ultimate on turn 1 though. If you want to keep it simple, stick to using the S1 until you're ready to consume blade resonance via the ultimate. Again, each of Phaetusa's attacks is followed by an instance of damage from Lacerating Wound. On round 3, Phaetusa recharges her index via support actions, allowing her the next use of her S2. This gets her back to 1 stack of blade resonance. Since she wants to maximize her damage on the final turn, she will no longer use the ultimate before then. Instead, she follows up with her S1 once more. This is essentially Phaetusa's gameplay loop from here on out. Stack blade resonance via her S2 when available, and use the S1 until you're ready to nuke. Jumping ahead to the final round of the match. Phaetusa starts by using her S2 to gain the 3rd stack of blade resonance. But before moving on to her ultimate, she has another mechanic at her disposal that further enhances her burst damage. Once per battle, or twice at V3 and above, Phaetusa can use her passive like any active ability following her S2. Doing so will grant her reversion and extra command. Reversion makes it so that when Phaetusa ends this turn, she will revert to her state at the time of activating her passive, allowing her another attack. Essentially, the buffed up ultimate can be performed twice. That said, she will now use the ultimate with 3 stacks of blade resonance. Here, we see a first instance of 70.5k damage, the base value of the ultimate at a multiplier of 120% of Phaetusa's attack. Then, an instance of bonus damage is added for each stack of blade resonance. First, the previous value is doubled for a total of 141k. Then, another instance triggers for a total of 211k. And finally, the last stack of blade resonance is consumed for the 3rd and additional instance of damage, quadrupling the original damage value of 70.5k for a total of 282k damage. Note that blade resonance was indeed consumed by the ultimate. As usual, Lacerating Wound triggers afterwards, adding another 105k damage to the tally. Now that Phaetusa's turn is over, Reversion activates, essentially rewinding her to the beginning of her turn. Crucially, she's back at 3 stacks of blade resonance. Thus, she uses her ultimate once more for a quadrupled damage value of 282k plus 105k follow-up. Overall, that's almost 800k damage this round and closer to 1 million when counting her support actions. While this does require a lengthy build-up, the payoff is presumably worth it. Here's the damage overview for this match. Both Cluke and Lind are V6, while Phaetusa is only V0. With a damage contribution of about 23%, she's certainly pulling her own weight against the maxed out teammates. It's encouraging to see a DPS perform well without additional copies. At V6, Phaetusa significantly outperforms Cluke, though only for a short while, as Cluke's expansion key will allow her to reclaim the throne. With that, you've seen the gist of Phaetusa's kit. In contrast to her simple skills, her damage output is somewhat complex. Her gameplay revolves around building up stacks of blade resonance for huge burst damage, with additional sources of damage from her support actions and Lacerating Wound. At V0, you only get to unleash one fully amplified ultimate in a 7-turn battle, so as noted, you usually want to align this with the boss's greatest damage window. Irrespective of Phaetusa's investment, you're going to use the S2 on odd-numbered rounds to build up blade resonance stacks, which I denoted here in subscript for clarity. Then, you simply bide your time using the S1 when you're outside of the burst window. In this example, the burst occurred on round 7. Since you're getting a total of 4 blade resonance stacks over the course of 7 turns, you're free to consume 1 at the start of battle. Alternatively, if the enemy has no mechanic that clearly favors a specific turn to burst, you can prioritize speed and unleash your nuke at the earliest on turn 5. This would mean that you're consuming the 4th blade resonance stack right afterwards on turn 7, assuming the fight ends at that point. Starting from V1, Phaetusa generates 2 blade resonance stacks with her S2 every other round, meaning she needs to use the S2 only twice to fully stack blade resonance. This changes the picture slightly, as you're able to unleash a maxed out ultimate on turn 3, plus another one on turn 7. For Gunsmoke, you generally would still rather use the passive for the full burst on turn 7, though in other boss fights such as Crossroad Challenge, you would also be able to unleash your major burst on turn 3. Finally, from V3 and above, Phaetusa gets to use her passive twice per battle, allowing her to nuke both on turn 3 and turn 7 with a double ultimate at 3 blade resonance stacks. This streamlines the rotation, as you're essentially looking at a contained 3-turn cycle, plus an in-between use of the S1. Now, the obvious team setup for Phaetusa is the Corrosion team. At V0, she serves as a replacement for Petya, providing more damage while contributing a sufficient number of corrosion attacks for Klukai's cooldown reset. At higher investment, she currently takes over the role as the team's hyper carry, though as noted, this changes with Klukai's expansion key. Michti is Phaetusa's favorite partner, as she significantly boosts the damage of her support actions. With Lyn plus a flexible 5th slot, you're looking at a quasi-mono corrosion lineup, or you'd pair Phaetusa, Klukai and Michti with another elemental core, such as Yui and Voimastina, or Springfield and Holo. If you already have Lyn to fill the spot on mixed lineups and don't care to build a mono corrosion team, there's going to be another less traditional setup for which you may want to pick up Phaetusa. Due to the benefit of foresight, we know that Sextons will enable a new team archetype revolving around blade weapons. I've made a dedicated preview for her, so I'll only briefly cover this here. Sextons buffs melee damage and initiates follow-up attacks when a blade user makes an attack against a target standing on electric tiles. Here you can see Alrid go in for her multiple attacks, each followed by electric damage from Sextons, consuming one confectance point at a time. By the time Phaetusa makes her attack, Sextons is out of points, but that limitation is lifted at V6. Since Phaetusa's support actions are considered melee damage, they will also trigger Sextons' follow-up attacks. Due to the synergy, Sextons can slot into the corrosion team, or Phaetusa may go into the electric team. Alternatively, you can build a mixed lineup around Sextons, Alrid, Phaetusa and 2 flex picks. The blade team is missing a few pieces to field a full lineup, so it's too early to tell if this will ever be meta. Still, it's looking quite formidable already. For good measure, we'll conclude by taking a look at the turn 3 burst damage from the V6 Phaetusa, who now unleashes her full power with 3 stacks of blade resonance and a double ultimate due to reversion. That's a bit over 3 million damage, shaving off roughly 20% of the boss's HP. That brings us to Phaetusa's investment breakpoints. As you notice from her power progression chart, the transitions are extremely smooth. Without an obvious power spike, she's perhaps one of the very few DPS characters that doesn't outright punish you for your free-to-play lifestyle. We've discussed most of her relevant upgrades already during her rotations, so let us briefly recap. Her V1 makes her gain more blade resonance stacks, allowing her to reach max stacks with every other use of the S2. In a 7-turn battle, this means one more fully buffed ultimate, or in other words, 2 more stacks. Aside from this modest change, she also gains an unconditional 15% crit damage bonus. Then, her V3 is the most relevant upgrade for rotation, as it allows her to use the active version of her passive one more time. With the increased blade resonance stacking from her V1, and now the additional activation of reversion, Phaetusa gets to unleash the buffed up ultimate twice per battle. She also gains a 50% attack bonus alongside reversion, making the nuke hit even harder. Next, her V4 is another reasonable breakpoint, significantly boosting the damage from her ultimate. The base multiplier is increased from 90% to 120%, and the bonus multiplier from blade resonance is doubled. Fully stacked, this changes the total multiplier from 480% to 720%, a difference of 240% or twice that with reversion. Lastly, at V6 she gains a buff after using her S2 that increases the damage multiplier of the next active attack by 200%. This doesn't interact with the damage multiplication from blade resonance, but it still adds a decent amount of extra damage to the total output. In terms of cost effectiveness, your choice is as usual between V0 and V6. However, Phaetusa's V4 comes pretty close with respect to the incremental value per upgrade, adding almost 30% per dupe, which is comparable to the V6. Qualitatively, you'll feel the biggest change from her V3 due to the smoother rotation. If you're low on funds and are only trying to figure out whether you should get her signature weapon or her V1, it largely depends on whether you have a substitute blade weapon available. The SSR alternatives are only about 10% behind the signature blade, making her V1 greater in value. If you can only get the SR version of Phaetusa's blade, you're looking at a difference of about 20%, which makes it equivalent to the V1. Since the weapon banner has a lower chance to fail, you're better off pulling her weapon then. That said, her signature weapon Cause and Effect comes with the highest base attack amongst all blades and grants 25% bonus crit damage. Its weapon effect boosts corrosion damage by 15% up to 30%, plus another 15% up to 30% after using her S2. The weapon trait adds another 10% bonus damage for a total bonus of up to 40% without calibrations. A reasonable alternative is the Battle Pass blade, granting an easy to activate damage bonus of 15% up to 30%, plus some bonus stability damage that comes in handy against bosses. Alrid's blade is another decent substitute, but if you intend to run them together on a blade lineup, that's not a future-proof alternative. As noted, the SSR alternatives are about 10% behind in total damage output as compared to a signature weapon. If you have none of these, your next best option is the SR version of Phaetusa's blade, which grants up to 20% bonus damage to her ultimate, plus a 10% unconditional bonus from the weapon trait. The best attachment set is Close Assault by a significant margin. Since everything in Phaetusa's kit deals melee damage, she gets a permanent 36% damage bonus from this set. Her preferred substats are attack and crit. Her Remold pattern consists of 4 Sentinel and 2 Vanguard slots. Make sure to equip 2 Sentinel pieces with attack boost as the main stat, since that's harder to come by than damage bonuses. The other 2 slots should either have Area Specialization, which works for all content, or Thronebreaker, which boosts damage against bosses. The Vanguard slots may go for Smite boost, or better yet Area Smite for a universal crit damage boost, or Beheading Blade for crit damage against bosses. The best substats to look for are Corrosive Smite and Corrosion Boost, as well as Ichor Conversion, which boosts attack by a percentage of your HP. Follow-up Strike is a decent filler, as it boosts damage against ability broken targets. Avoid effects that target either active or out of turn damage, since Phaetusa has a mix of both. Moving on to her fixed keys. The keys you will likely use for all content are her second and third keys. The second key applies Lacerating Wound to all opponents at the start of every other round for 1 turn. This ensures that even before using hers too, the enemy is affected by the debuff, so that her support actions trigger the bonus damage. Her third key grants 15% bonus damage when her attacks hit only 1 target, which is practically always the case against most bosses. For the last slot, you may use her first key for a fairly generic option, though its utility diminishes as the quality of your gear increases. The key grants a permanent 20% crit rate bonus once you reach 3 stacks of Blade Resonance. At V0, this takes at least 5 turns to accomplish, making it almost irrelevant, not to mention that you likely overcap on crit rate. At V1 and above, you can activate this effect as early as turn 3, though I'd say that's still too late to divert substates elsewhere. As an alternative, you can slot in a 5th key for buff removal against opponents where this is useful. For common keys, you can use her own key that boosts her damage by 10% after using her as 2. The bonus generally doesn't apply to her support actions, which occur prior to her turn, and it also excludes even-numbered rounds in which she only uses her as 1, making it not the most universal option. The best choices would be the keys from Lind, Sakura and Dushevnaya, which essentially provide 10% bonus damage with no condition. Since these characters aren't available to everyone, some accessible alternatives would be the key from Tolo, as Phaetusa deals damage without a filled index almost all of the time, as well as from the usual suspects Weblade, Alrid, Shakri and Litara. In summary, Phaetusa is a purebred boss killer who unleashes massive burst damage after several turns of build-up. She offers good performance even at V0 and functions as a direct upgrade over Petya, whose primary role was simply facilitating Clukei's cooldown resets. If you have the funds to invest further, you'll be pleased to know she has some of the smoothest vertebrae transitions in the game, with impactful breakpoints in the mid-range. At full investment, Phaetusa takes over as the team's hyper carry, effectively bringing the Corrosion squad back into the meta. Additionally, she's a core member of the blade-centered lineup enabled by Sextants, essentially giving you 2 team archetypes for the price of 1. On the flip side, Phaetusa's playstyle is slow, requiring a lengthy build-up for her best damage output. At V0, she needs at least 5 turns to reach her full potential, making her impractical for shorter encounters. While her burst-heavy setup is well suited for Gunsmoke, players with smaller rosters looking to maximize account value should probably prioritize more versatile characters, unless you are specifically aiming for that Sextant synergy. On a similar note, for players with few resources, it's worth noting that there's no accessible SSR blade. While her SR option is serviceable, it's a far cry from the competitive alternatives usually available to other classes. Finally, heavy vertical investment in Phaetusa is somewhat discouraged by the looming arrival of Clukei's expansion key. While there's nothing wrong with having 2 powerhouses on the team, players who rarely go for V6 upgrades are better advised to spread their resources across multiple teams. If you already have an invested Clukei, you only have to wait a little longer for her to reclaim her spot at the apex of the meta. In conclusion, the pulling recommendation for most players is V0 or skip, though there's nothing wrong with going for some of her upgrades if you have the funds. Phaetusa is a capable damage dealer who excels in Gunsmoke and holds a solid spot on both Mono Corrosion and Sextants-led mixed setups. That brings us to the end of this video. Hopefully, you found this guide helpful in understanding Phaetusa's kit and her role in the current landscape. As usual, let me know what your pulling plans are. Are you looking to take your Corrosion score to the next level, or are you saving for someone else? In any case, thank you so much for watching. See you next time.